The sun had barely risen over the hills of Jerusalem when Nathanael was already at his post in the temple. His fingers, stained with the black ink he used to copy the sacred texts, moved with precision over the parchment. The small room where he worked was on the eastern side of the temple complex, allowing the first light of morning to naturally illuminate his work through the narrow window. The aroma of morning incense still hung in the air, mingling with the characteristic smell of new parchment and ink. At only 17 years old, Nathanael had already earned the trust of the high priest Josiah for his dedication and exceptional talent in the art of sacred writing. Each letter he traced was like a silent prayer, each word an act of devotion. "Praise the Lord," he murmured to himself as he blew gently on the fresh ink. His brown eyes carefully examined each stroke, searching for imperfections that might compromise the sanctity of the text. On the cedar table before him, carefully arranged, was his collection of instruments. Quills of varying thicknesses, inkwells in various shades of black, pumice stones to smooth the parchment, and bronze rulers to keep the lines perfectly straight. Each item had its own place, reflecting the young scribe's methodical nature. A sudden movement in the curtain separating his office from the main hallway caught his eye. It was Ruth, one of the temple's younger servants, carrying a pitcher of fresh water. "Good morning, Nathanael," she greeted with a shy smile. "The high priest asked to see if you needed anything." "I'm fine, Ruth, thank you," he replied, returning her smile. "Just tell the high priest that I'm almost done with the copy of the Psalms he requested." But before Ruth could leave, a deep, authoritative voice echoed through the hallway. "Nathanael, I need you right away." The young scribe instantly recognized the voice of High Priest Josiah. Ruth quickly disappeared behind the curtain, while Nathanael stood up, straightening his ink-stained white robes. He took a few seconds to organize his parchments, cover his inkwells, and wipe his hands on a damp cloth. "Nathanael," the voice sounded closer and more urgent. "I am coming, my lord," he replied, quickly stepping through the curtain and into the polished stone corridor. The main corridor of the temple was an architectural masterpiece, with its majestic columns and vaulted ceiling. Sunlight, filtering through small openings above, created dancing patterns on the stone floor. Nathanael always felt small in this space, as if the corridor itself were a constant reminder of God's greatness. As Nathanael entered the main chamber, he found an unexpected sight. Josiah was not alone. Beside him stood his daughter Miriam, a young woman of 15 whose honey-colored eyes seemed to hold a wisdom beyond her years. She rarely appeared in this part of the temple, preferring to spend her time in the gardens or helping with the grain offerings. But what caught Nathanael's attention most was the third occupant of the room, a road-worn man with a neatly trimmed gray beard and deep-set eyes that seemed to assess everything around him. His clothing, though dusty from travel, was of good quality, suggesting that he was someone of considerable standing. "Nathanael," Josiah began, his voice softer now but no less authoritative, "this is Eliab, a merchant from Samaria." The merchant inclined his head slightly in greeting. There was something in his eyes, a mixture of urgency and concern, that made Nathanael's stomach tighten. "He brings disturbing news from the northern kingdom," Josiah continued, his hand unconsciously stroking his gray beard, a habit Nathanael knew indicated concern. "The prophets of Baal," Eliab began, his deep voice carrying a note of lamentation, "they multiply like locusts in our cities. The palace is full of them, whispering poison in the king's ears. Our young men are seduced by their rituals. Our children grow up without knowing the name of the true God." Nathanael watched as Miriam took a few steps closer, her eyes fixed on the merchant, drinking in every word with an intensity he had never seen in her before. "But there is more," Eliab continued, lowering his voice even further, forcing everyone to come closer. "Rumors are coming from the east. The Assyrians are on the move, and as our king indulges in idolatry, our borders grow ever more vulnerable." Josiah let out a heavy sigh, walking to one of the windows that overlooked the temple courtyard. For a few moments, only the distant sound of birds and the murmur of worshippers below filled the room. "We need someone in Samaria," Josiah finally declared, turning to face Nathanael. "Someone young, versed in the scriptures. Someone capable of copying and preserving the sacred texts before it is too late." Nathanael's heart raced. He looked at his worktable visible through the open door, at the partially completed scrolls, at the orderly and secure life he had built within these sacred walls. "My lord," he began, his voice betraying his insecurity, Surely there are others more qualified, more experienced scribes. You have been chosen, Nathanael, Josiah interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. The Lord has a purpose for each of us, even when his ways seem mysterious to our eyes. Father, Miriam's voice rang out clear and determined, surprising everyone. Let me go with him. I can help with the manuscripts, and a woman will draw less attention. No. Josiah's response was immediate and stern, but his tone soon softened as he saw his daughter's determined expression. Your mission is different, my daughter. Soon you will marry Elkanah, uniting our family with the line of the prophets. Miriam's eyes met Nathanael's for a brief moment, and in that look he saw something that disturbed him deeply, a mixture of defiance, determination, and something else he could not define. In that moment, standing in the main chamber of the temple in Jerusalem, Nathanael felt his ordered, predictable world crumble around him. The path he had planned for his life, the certainties he had cultivated, all seemed as fragile as the thin layer of ink on his parchment. The road between Jerusalem and Samaria wound through rocky hills and lush valleys. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the small caravan as it made its way along at a steady pace. Nathanael, mounted on a stubborn donkey, alternated his attention between the road ahead and the precious leather bag he carried, filled with parchment and writing instruments. Keep your eyes on the horizon, advised Eliab, who rode a few yards ahead. Bandits often watch caravans from those heights. He pointed to a set of rocky hills to the right. The merchant had organized a small caravan as cover for his real mission. 5 legitimate traders, 3 families with children, and a dozen servants made up the group, providing the perfect cover for transporting sacred texts into the hostile territory of the north. How long until we reach Samaria? Nathanael asked, adjusting his position on the donkey for the 10th time that hour. His thighs ached from the constant movement, and his back protested the unaccustomed posture. At this rate, 3 more days, Eliab replied, as long as we don't encounter complications. A child's shrill cry cut through the air, causing Nathanael to jump on his mount. But it was just one of the young travelers, playing with his siblings in one of the wagons. Don't be so tense, young scribe, Eliab smiled. The Lord has not brought us this far to abandon us now. The hours dragged by under the harsh sun. Nathanael watched the landscape gradually change. The familiar hills of Judah receded, giving way to a territory he knew only from the maps he had copied in the temple. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of purple and gold, Eliab signaled for the caravan to stop. We will camp in that grove, he announced, indicating a small group of trees near a spring. There is shelter and fresh water. The camp was set up with the efficiency that comes from experience. Families set up their tents, merchants checked their wares, and servants prepared fires for dinner. Nathanael tried to be helpful, but his hands, more accustomed to handling quills and parchment, were awkward with the ropes and stakes. Here, a female voice offered assistance. You need to wrap it around twice before you can tie the knot. Nathanael turned to thank her and froze. There, helping him with the tent rope, was a figure he knew all too well. Miriam, he whispered, shocked. How? Why? She smiled, that same defiant smile he had seen in the temple. Her simple traveling robes and the hood that partially covered her face made her almost unrecognizable to anyone who didn't know her well. It wasn't easy to lose the temple guards, she said casually, as if she were talking about the weather. But the Lord provides a way for those who trust in him. Your father will. Nathanael began, but was interrupted. My father plans our lives like pieces on his chessboard, Miriam said, her voice now carrying a hint of bitterness. But the Lord has his own plans, doesn't he? Did you know that? Nathanael addressed Eliab, who was approaching silently. The merchant nodded slightly. Sometimes, young scribe, God's plans are revealed through the actions of the most unlikely servants. And we will need all the help we can get in Samaria. That night, while most travelers slept, Nathanael lay awake, watching the stars through the leaves of the trees. His mind was full of worries and unanswered questions. The stars will not give you the answers you seek, Miriam said, sitting down beside him. The night air was cool, and she wrapped a shawl around herself. How can you be so calm? He asked. Your father will be furious. The marriage to Elkanah. I had a dream, she interrupted, her eyes fixed on the stars. The night after we met Eliab. It was so vivid. I saw Samaria. I saw people thirsting for truth. I saw a purpose greater than arranged marriages and empty traditions. But what if we're wrong? What if this isn't God's plan? Miriam turned to him, her eyes shining in the starlight. Nathaniel, when you copy the sacred texts, what do you read about God's servants? Were they always sure of their ways? Did they always understand God's plan from the beginning? He thought for a moment, remembering the stories he knew so well. No, he finally admitted. Usually they just got ahead, trusting. Exactly, she smiled. And that's what we're doing now. Across the camp, Eliab watched the two young men talking. His experienced eyes noted the patrols that occasionally passed along the main road, the movements in the distant hills, the signs that only a seasoned traveler would recognize. Protect them, Lord, he whispered in a silent prayer. For the path ahead is more dangerous than they realize. The night wore on, and the camp gradually fell silent, save for the occasional crackle of the fires and the soft whisper of the wind in the trees. Tomorrow would be another day of travel, another step toward Samaria and the challenges that awaited them. The first sight of Samaria took Nathanael's breath away. The city rose majestically on the hill, its white walls gleaming in the midday sun as if they were made of polished silver. Limestone towers jutted skyward, and the royal palace, at the highest point of the city, seemed to touch the clouds. Isn't it impressive? Eliab commented, noticing the young scribe's look of wonder. But don't let its outward beauty fool you. The city is like a fruit that is beautiful on the outside but corrupt on the inside. As the caravan approached the main gates, Nathanael began to understand what Eliab meant. Just outside the walls, statues of Baal and Asherah stood like silent sentinels, their grotesque forms decorated with fresh offerings of flowers and grain. Keep your hoods down, Eliab instructed quietly. And remember, we are just ordinary merchants seeking profit in the market of Samaria. The gatekeepers seemed bored, more interested in the wine they were sharing than in properly inspecting the travelers. One of them, however, gave Miriam a long look, and she quickly lowered her face beneath her hood. Where do you come from? The guard asked, his voice slurred with alcohol. Hebron, Eliab replied without hesitation. We bring spices and fabrics for the market. The guard waved dismissively, allowing the caravan to pass. As soon as they passed through the gates, Nathanael felt as if he had entered a world completely different from the one he knew. The streets of Samaria throbbed with feverish energy. Merchants shouted their wares, children ran between the market stalls, and the air was thick with a mixture of aromas, exotic spices, roasting meat, incense, and something else, something that made Nathanael's stomach turn. It's the smell of sacrifices, Miriam murmured beside him, as if reading his thoughts. They burn offerings to Baal day and night. On every street corner there was an altar, in every square a statue. Some were small, just crudely carved stones. Others were elaborate monuments of bronze and stone. The most disturbing thing, Nathanael thought, was how completely at ease the people seemed to be with it all, stopping casually to make offerings or burn incense before going about their daily business. Eliab led the group through narrow alleys, gradually moving away from the hustle and bustle of the main market. The streets grew quieter, the houses more modest. Finally, they stopped in front of a simple but well-kept residence. An elderly woman was waiting for them at the door, as if she knew exactly when they would arrive. Her graying hair was covered by a simple veil, but there was a dignity in her posture that immediately caught Nathanael's attention. Welcome to Sarah's house, Eliab introduced. She has been our ally for more years than you have been alive, young scribe. Sarah examined each of them with piercing eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances. So these are the young men of Jerusalem, she said finally. Enter quickly. The walls of Samaria have eyes and ears. The interior of the house was surprisingly spacious. A central courtyard let in natural light, and several doors led to other rooms. Sarah led them to a back room, where a simple meal had already been prepared. Eat first, she instructed. Then we will discuss what brings you here. Although, she added with a meaningful glance at Nathaniel's bag of parchments. "I have my suspicions." As they ate, Sarah updated them on the situation in the city. "You have arrived at a crucial time," she explained. "The king has called a great celebration for Baal in 3 days' time. All the priests and prophets will be present." "And the followers of the true God?" Miriam asked, leaning forward. Sarah sighed heavily. "Hidden, fearful. Some meet in secret in the catacombs beneath the city. Others keep small altars in their homes, always fearing discovery. But," she lowered her voice, "there is something more troubling." "The Assyrians?" Eliab asked. Sarah nodded. "The king's spies report movements on the borders, but he is so intoxicated with his rituals and feasts that he refuses to see the real danger. He prefers to trust in the protection of his idols." That night, as they helped Sarah organize the scrolls in the basement of the house, Nathaniel found a scroll that was different from the others. The scroll was older, the text written in a style he did not fully recognize. "What is this?" he asked, holding the scroll carefully. Sarah took the scroll reverently. "The prophecies," she replied. "Words of warning and hope that the king refuses to hear. We keep these texts here, waiting for the right moment." His voice was interrupted by shouts from the street. The sound of stampeding footsteps echoed off the stone walls, and through the cracks in the basement window, they could see the glow of approaching torches. "It has begun," Eliab muttered darkly. "They are searching for those who will not bow to Baal." Nathaniel's gaze met Miriam's in the dim light of the basement. For the first time since they had left Jerusalem, he saw genuine fear in her eyes. But there was something else too, a steely determination that recalled the ancient stories of heroes and prophets he had used to copy in the temple. Sarah quickly extinguished the lamps, leaving only one small candle burning. "Be silent," she instructed. "This is not the first time we have faced nights like this, and it will not be the last." As the sound of boots and shouts filled the streets of Samaria, the four of them stood still in the darkness of the basement, each lost in their own thoughts and prayers. Nathaniel realized that somehow this moment, hiding in a basement in a foreign land, protecting sacred texts from the authorities, was exactly where he was meant to be. God's plan, he was beginning to understand, rarely followed the paths we imagine for ourselves. The days that followed their arrival in Samaria settled into a tense but methodical routine. During the daylight hours, Nathaniel and Miriam remained in the cool basement of Sarah's house, tirelessly copying the sacred texts by the light of oil lamps. Above them, the city bustled with preparations for the great Baal celebration. The sound of ritual drums occasionally penetrated even the thick walls of the basement, making Nathaniel flinch each time the pagan rhythm interrupted his concentration. "How do you keep your hand so steady?" Miriam asked, watching in amazement as Nathaniel traced perfectly aligned characters on the new parchment. "Years of practice," he replied, never taking his eyes off his work. "And also, it helps to imagine that each letter is a little prayer. It keeps my thoughts focused on the Lord, not on the sounds outside." A knock on the basement door made them both freeze. They relaxed only when they heard the agreed-upon code, 3 quick knocks followed by 2 slow ones. "I have brought fresh water and some bread," Sarah said, descending the worn steps with a tray. "And also of visitors." Behind her, 2 figures emerged from the gloom of the staircase. One was Eliab, his face etched with concern. The other was a young man Nathaniel did not recognize, dressed in simple shepherd's clothes. "This is Ishmael," Eliab introduced. "He brings news from the palace." The young shepherd approached the table where the scribes worked, his eyes wide as he looked at the sacred texts. "So it is true," he murmured. "There are still those who preserve the word of the Lord." "Ishmael works in the palace stables," Sarah explained. "His ears pick up much of what the king's advisors think they are saying in secret." The shepherd nodded, lowering his voice even further. "The priests of Baal are not satisfied with just the celebration. They plan something bigger." "What do you mean?" Miriam asked, setting aside her pen. "A decree," Ishmael replied, his voice shaking slightly. "The king will be persuaded to issue a decree requiring everyone in Samaria to participate in Baal's rituals. Not just the grand celebration, but all the rituals, all the offerings, all the feasts. A heavy silence fell over the basement. Nathanael felt a shiver run down his spine as he thought of the implications. "What about those who refuse?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Ishmael just shook his head, his eyes downcast. "That can't happen," Miriam declared, standing abruptly. "There must be something we can do." "And there is," Sarah replied, her voice calm but firm. She walked over to an ancient chest in the corner of the basement and removed a scroll of parchment that Nathanael had never seen before. "What is this?" he asked, intrigued by the apparent antiquity of the document. "History," Sarah replied, carefully unrolling the parchment on the table. "History and prophecy. Words that remind us that this is not the first time God's people have faced such challenges." Nathanael stepped closer, his eyes scanning the ancient text. This tells of..." "Yes," Sarah confirmed, "about a time when another king also tried to force the people to abandon their faith. About how a small group of believers stood firm, trusting not in numbers or strength, but in the power of the Lord." "But that story," Eliab began, his eyes widening with understanding. "You are not suggesting..." "I am suggesting that the Lord has not changed," Sarah replied firmly. "His ways remain the same. And just as he manifested his power then, he can manifest it again." "But we need a plan," Ishmael interjected. "The priests of Baal are powerful. They have the king's support, armed guards." "It is no accident that you have arrived now," Sarah said, looking meaningfully at Nathanael and Miriam. "It is no accident that we have preserved these texts, these stories of faith and courage." Miriam approached the parchment, her fingers gently tracing the ancient letters. "What exactly are you proposing, Sarah?" The old woman smiled, a smile that seemed to carry both wisdom and a touch of cunning. "I propose that we use their own celebration against them, that we turn their moment of greatest triumph into a demonstration of the power of the true God." "That is madness," Eliab exclaimed. "It would be suicide." "Perhaps," Sarah agreed. "Or perhaps this is exactly what the Lord planned all along. Why else would he have brought a temple scribe and a priest's daughter to Samaria at this very moment?" Nathanael felt all eyes turn to him. His heart was pounding as the implications of what Sarah was suggesting began to form in his mind. "What do we need to do?" he finally asked, his voice firmer than he felt. Sarah began to explain her plan, and as she spoke, Nathanael realized that the story he knew so well, the one he had copied so many times in the temple scrolls, was about to come to life before his eyes. The night was drawing on, and in the lamplit basement, a small group of believers were planning one of the most daring displays of faith that Samaria would ever see. Outside, the drums of pagan rituals continued their incessant rhythm, unaware that their days were numbered. The eve of the great celebration dawned with a sky heavy with dark clouds. Sarah's house had become a makeshift refuge for several faithful who refused to participate in the rituals. The normally quiet inner courtyard was now buzzing with anxious whispers and murmured prayers. Nathanael watched from the cellar entrance as another group arrived, led by Ishmael through the dark alleys of the city. There were 3 families this time, including small children who clung to their mother's skirts, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. "We can't shelter anyone else," Eliab murmured, approaching silently. "We're already risking too much." Sarah, who was organizing blankets and distributing bread among the refugees, looked up at the comment. "Should we close our doors to our brothers?" "It's not a question of closing doors," Eliab replied, his voice tense. "It's a question of survival. The more people here, the greater the risk of being discovered." A young shepherd, not much older than Nathanael, stood up from his corner. "He's right," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "We can't just hide forever." "Joab's right," another refugee agreed. "We have to do something." Sarah gestured for everyone to come closer. The group gathered in a tight circle in the center of the courtyard, some sitting on the floor, others leaning against the walls. Miriam, who was helping an elderly woman with her meal, joined the circle. "There's an old story," Sarah began, her voice low but clear, "about a prophet who single-handedly faced 450 prophets of Baal." Nathanael felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew the story well. He had copied it dozens of times in the temple. He had no army, Sarah continued. He had no political power, no wealth, no influence. All he had was his unshakable faith in the God of our fathers. And what happened? One of the children asked, her voice small but curious. Miriam smiled gently at the child. The Lord answered with fire from heaven, she said. He demonstrated his power in a way that no one could deny. But that was different, Eliab protested. That was a prophet chosen by God. We are just ordinary people. Sarah stood up slowly, her small frame suddenly looming larger in the dim light of the courtyard. And who do you think the 3 young men were who refused to bow down to the golden statue? They were not prophets, they were not priests. They were ordinary young men, like you, who simply refused to deny their faith. A deep silence fell over the group. Nathanael could hear, in the distance, the sound of drums announcing the preparations for the next day's celebration. What exactly are you suggesting, Sarah? Joab asked, leaning forward. Tomorrow, she replied, when everyone is gathered for the celebration, we will make our own demonstration of faith. This is madness, one of the women exclaimed. They will kill us. Perhaps, Sarah agreed. Or perhaps the Lord is calling us to this particular moment. Perhaps that is why we preserve the ancient stories, why we keep alive the memory of God's great deeds. Nathanael stepped to the center of the circle. Sarah is right, he said, surprised at the firmness in his own voice. I spent years copying these stories in the temple, but now I see that they are not just records of the past. They are a call to the present. Miriam stood beside him. We did not come from Jerusalem just to hide in a cellar. If the Lord brought us here, it was for a purpose. Sarah looked around the circle, her eyes finding every face present. Each of you has a choice to make today, she said softly. I will not judge you if you choose to bow down, but those who choose to stand firm, follow the plan. One by one, the refugees began to nod. Some had tears in their eyes, others had steely determination on their faces. Are the scrolls safe? Eliab asked, his voice now resigned but resolute. Yes, Nathanael replied. Hidden where we agreed. Sarah walked to the center of the circle and spread her hands. Then let us pray, she said. For tomorrow Samaria will see the power of the living God. As the prayers rose like a soft murmur in the night, Nathanael felt Miriam take his hand. In her touch, there was both fear and courage, both uncertainty and determination. Outside the house, the drums of pagan ritual continued their incessant rhythm, and the dark clouds in the sky promised a storm. But inside the courtyard, a small group of worshippers prepared to weather their own storm, trusting that the same God who had answered with fire from heaven in the past was still in control. The sun rose blood-red over Samaria, its first light tinging the low-lying clouds with crimson hues that made the city's white walls seem bathed in fire. Nathanael watched the dawn from the high window of the room where he had spent the night keeping vigil, his hands unconsciously caressing the scroll of parchment containing the ancient prophecies. The sound of soft footsteps behind him announced Miriam's arrival. The others are waking, she said softly. Sarah wants to see us all before. Her voice trailed off on the last word, but Nathanael understood. Before it all began. Before they crossed that line from which there would be no return. In the inner courtyard, Sarah gathered everyone into a tight circle. The space seemed smaller now, with so many people huddled together. Entire families, merchants, shepherds, artisans, all united by their faith and their fear. Each of you has a choice to make today, Sarah began, her voice steady despite her age. I will not judge those who choose to bow down. The Lord knows the hearts of each person, and it is not our place to condemn those who do not feel called to this moment. She paused, her eyes roaming over each face present. But those who choose to remain steadfast, follow the plan exactly as we discussed. Once we begin, there will be no turning back. Are the scrolls safe? Eliab asked, his expression more serious than usual. Yes, Nathanael replied. Hidden in the place we agreed, in case something goes wrong. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Ishmael, who had just returned from his morning round of the city, brought the latest news. The streets are already crowded. People from all the surrounding towns have come for the celebration. The priests of Baal began the preliminary rituals at sunrise. Sarah nodded. Then it is time. One by one, the refugees began to prepare. Some wept silently, others prayed softly. Parents hugged their children. Couples kissed each other goodbye with tense kisses. Remember, Sarah instructed, we must blend into the crowd in small groups. Don't draw attention to ourselves until the right moment. Nathanael watched as the first groups began to leave, exiting through the back of the house and heading in separate directions toward the central temple. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear him. Are you afraid? Miriam asked, approaching him. Terrified, he admitted with a small smile. But also at peace somehow, as if everything in my life had been preparing me for this moment. All those years of copying the old stories. Yes, he added. Now I understand that I wasn't just preserving the past. I was preparing for the present. Sarah approached the two young men, her eyes shining with unusual intensity. You both have a special role today, she said. Nathanael, you know the scriptures better than anyone here. And Miriam, you have the blood of the priests of Jerusalem in your veins. Together, you represent the link between the past and the future of our faith. Outside, the sound of ritual drums had increased, and thick smoke was beginning to rise from the central temple, where the morning sacrifices had already begun. It is time, Sarah declared. The last group prepared to leave. It consisted only of Sarah, Nathanael, Miriam, and Eliab. Before they left, Sarah gathered everyone in a final circle of prayer. Lord, her voice was barely a whisper, as you have been with your servants in the past, so you are with us today. May your name be glorified in Samaria, no matter what happens to us. As they stepped out into the bustling streets of the city, Nathanael felt the weight of history on his shoulders. The words she had copied so many times echoed in her mind. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. The crowd grew larger with every turn they turned. The temple of Baal loomed before them, its monumental columns seeming to touch the red sky. Hundreds of people crowded into its courtyards and stairways, while elaborately robed priests conducted the preliminary rituals. In the center of it all, on a lofty throne, sat the king of Israel, surrounded by his court and hundreds of prophets of Baal. The air was thick with incense, and the ritual drums beat out a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to make the city itself pulse. Sarah took one last look at her companions. In their eyes was a mixture of love, determination, and a peace that transcended the moment. Let it begin, she murmured. Chaos erupted in the temple the moment Sarah stepped forward, her voice cutting through the din of drums and chants like a sharp sword. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. The silence that followed was absolute, as if all of Samaria had held its breath at once. The drums stopped abruptly, and even the wind seemed to cease. Armed guards immediately advanced toward Sarah, but then something extraordinary happened. As if moved by an unseen force, dozens of ordinary people, merchants, shepherds, artisans, emerged from the crowd, forming a human barrier around her. Nathanael recognized the faces. They were the refugees from Sarah's household, each taking his position as planned. "Arrest this woman," ordered the high priest of Baal, his voice shrill with rage. "She desecrates our sacred ritual." But Sarah remained impassive, her voice now louder. "I propose a challenge," she proclaimed, her eyes fixed on the king. "Let your prophets call upon Baal, and we will call upon the Lord. The God who answers with fire, that is the true God." A murmur ran through the crowd. The challenge was too bold to ignore, but accepting it would mean giving legitimacy to the worshippers of the God of Israel. The king, who had been watching with a bored expression, leaned forward in his throne, suddenly interested. There was something about the challenge that piqued his curiosity, or perhaps it was just his fondness for entertainment. "So be it," he declared, gesturing for the guards to step back. "Let the old woman speak. This might be interesting." The prophets of Baal, 450 men in elaborate robes, began their rituals. They danced around the altar, their movements growing more frantic as the sun rose higher in the sky. "O Baal, answer us!" they cried, their voices hoarse from crying out. The hours dragged by. The sun reached its zenith and began its descent toward the horizon. The prophets, in despair, began to cut themselves with knives and spears, as was their custom, until the blood ran down their bodies. "Perhaps your God is asleep," Sarah taunted, her voice full of irony. "Or perhaps he is traveling. Shout louder. Surely he will hear you." Nathanael, who was watching everything from Miriam's side, could hardly believe Sarah's boldness. But there was something in her confidence that kept him from feeling afraid. Finally, as the sun began to set and the prophets of Baal were exhausted and bloodied, Sarah stepped forward. With calm, deliberate gestures, she approached the ancient altar of the Lord, long abandoned. "Come," she called to the people. "Come near and see." The crowd, mesmerized by the day's spectacle, moved closer. Sarah began rebuilding the ruined altar, stone by stone. Nathanael and other believers stepped forward to help. 12 stones, Sarah instructed, one for each tribe of Israel, so that everyone will remember that we are one people under the Lord. When the altar was ready, Sarah ordered a trench dug around it. Then, to everyone's amazement, she asked for water to be poured over the sacrifice. "More," she ordered. "Pour more water." 3 times the water was poured, until the sacrifice was soaked and the trench overflowed. Then, in the silence of expectation, Sarah approached the altar. Her voice, when she spoke, was no longer the commanding voice that had challenged the prophets of Baal. It was barely a whisper, but it carried an intimacy that brought tears to Nathanael's eyes. "Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," she prayed, "let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word." A pause, and then, "Answer me, Lord. Answer me, so that these people may know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back to you." What happened next would be forever etched in the memory of all present. A flash of light, brighter than the sun, descended from the heavens. The fire of the Lord fell and consumed not only the sacrifice, but also the wood, the stones, the dust, and even licked up the water in the trench. The heat was so intense that everyone had to step back, shielding their faces with their hands. When they were finally able to look again, there was nothing on the altar but smoking ashes. The crowd, astonished, fell on their faces. "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" The cry began softly, but soon grew into a roar that echoed off the walls of Samaria. Nathanael looked at Miriam, who was weeping openly beside him. Their hands met and clasped tightly. In the midst of the prostrate crowd, Sarah stood, her face bathed in tears of joy, her eyes fixed on heaven. A month had passed since the events at the Temple of Baal. Samaria was a city transformed, though in subtle ways that only the most observant would notice. Pagan altars still stood on some street corners, but many were abandoned, covered in dust and cobwebs. The sound of ritual drums had diminished considerably, and people seemed freer to speak openly about their faith in the God of Israel. In Sarah's house, the inner courtyard was once again quiet. The refugee families had returned to their homes, though many still gathered regularly to study the sacred texts that Nathanael continued to copy with dedication. On this particular afternoon, Nathanael was on the terrace, organizing his scrolls in the golden light of the setting sun. The air was fragrant with the aroma of fresh bread that wafted from the kitchen, where Sarah was teaching some young women how to prepare the ancient Sabbath recipes. "I thought I would find you here," Miriam said, coming up the steps to the terrace with a small scroll in her hands. "A message has come from Jerusalem." Nathanael's heart quickened slightly. They had not heard from the holy city since the events at the temple. "It's from my father," Miriam continued, sitting down beside him on the stone bench. He says he understands now. Does he?" "Yes," she smiled, carefully unrolling the scroll. "He writes that sometimes our plans are not God's plans, and that this is a blessing in disguise. He says he has learned of the events in Samaria, and now sees the Lord's hand in everything that has happened." Nathanael let out a sigh he hadn't known he was holding. "What about your arranged marriage to Elkanah?" "Apparently," Miriam laughed softly, "Elkanah has found his own unexpected path. He has decided to join a band of traveling prophets, carrying the word of the Lord to the far-flung cities. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the clouds with shades of pink and gold. Across the terrace, Eliab emerged from the stairs, carrying a fresh scroll. "The stories of what happened here are already circulating throughout Israel," he said, joining the young men. "From Dan to Beersheba, people talk about the day the fire of the Lord fell on Samaria. Some say it is just a legend, others swear they saw it with their own eyes, but everyone talks about it." "And the king?" Nathanael asked. "Ah, the king." Eliab shook his head with a wry smile. "He has not completely converted, if that is what you mean. He still maintains some of his old ways. But he no longer persecutes the worshippers of the true God, and he has even allowed the ancient altar of the Lord to be officially restored." Sarah came up to the terrace at this point, her hands still lightly coated in flour. "The seeds have been planted," she said, looking fondly at her young companions. "Now we must cultivate what has been sown." "What about us?" Miriam asked, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "What do we do now?" Sarah sat in a nearby chair, her eyes shining with the wisdom that came from a lifetime of faith. "There is much work to be done," she replied. "The people need to be reconnected with their roots, with the ancient stories, with true worship. They need teachers, scribes, spiritual guides." "When I came to Samaria," Nathanael reflected, looking down at his ink-stained hands, "I thought I was abandoning my purpose as a temple scribe. Now I see that I was only beginning to truly discover it." "It's funny," Miriam smiled, "how God's plans are so different from ours, and yet when we look back, we see how perfectly orchestrated each step was." "Like a dance," Sarah added, "where we don't always know the next steps, but we trust the master who leads." Ishmael, who had just returned from his duties at the palace, joined the group on the terrace. "You won't believe what I heard today," he began, his face animated. "There are rumors that people from other cities are coming to Samaria, not to trade or attend pagan festivals, but to learn about the God of Israel." "Then that is what we will do," Nathanael declared, a new determination in his voice. "We will transform this house into a center of teaching and learning. We will copy more texts, train more scribes, share the ancient stories. And the new ones too," Miriam added, "including our own." The sun had finally set completely, and the first stars were beginning to dot the sky over Samaria. On the terrace of Sarah's house, for very different people, a young scribe from Jerusalem, a priest's daughter who defied convention, a merchant who became a messenger of faith, and an old woman whose wisdom had changed a city, looked to the future with renewed hope. Below, in the city, lights were coming on in the houses, and the distant sound of chanting, no longer the frenetic rhythms of pagan rituals, but the ancient psalms of praise to the God of Israel, was floating on the night breeze. Sarah closed her eyes, a serene smile on her wrinkled face. "The Lord is faithful," she murmured. "Always has been, always will be." And so, as night fell over Samaria, a new era began. An era not of confrontation and dramatic displays of power, but of quiet growth, of patient teaching, of faith lived day by day. The fire that had fallen from heaven now burned steadily in the hearts of the people, a flame that no royal decree could extinguish. What did you think of today's story here at Infinite Prayer? Please tell us in the comments which part touched your heart the most in this story of surrender to God's plans. Subscribe to the channel now, activate the notification bell, and also remember to press the like button so that YouTube can bring this message to more people, and share this video with someone you know who needs to hear this story today. Thank you for watching. See you tomorrow in our next video.